No alarm, no schedule, nowhere you're expected to be. You wake up when your body wakes you up, sit for a second, and ask yourself the only real question on the table: what do you feel like doing today? For roughly 300,000 years, that wasn't a daydream, that was just Tuesday. Every single morning, for the overwhelming majority of the time our species has existed, and the honest answer to that question looked almost nothing like the life you're living right now. The average person today spends something like 90,000 hours of their life at work, close to a third of their entire waking existence handed over to a job. But for most of human history, job wasn't a concept that existed at all. No employment, no wages, no boss, no ladder to climb. So what did people actually do with an entire day if none of that was on the table? Let's start with the number that made anthropologists rethink everything. In 1966, at a landmark conference called Man the Hunter, researcher Richard Lee presented fieldwork on the Kungsan, a hunter-gatherer people of the Kalahari Desert. His finding? Adults spent somewhere between 12 and 20 hours a week actually acquiring food. Marshall Solins ran with that number and coined a phrase that's been quoted in classrooms ever since: the original affluent society. That number is catchy. It's also only half the story. A few years later, anthropologists Kristen Hawkes and James O'Connell pointed out that Lee's hours only covered time spent hunting and gathering. They didn't include the hours afterward spent cracking nuts, pounding roots, hauling water, and making tools. When Lee redid the math to include all of that, his new total came out to 44.5 hours a week for men and 40.1 for women. And follow-up studies across dozens of other foraging societies landed in roughly that same range. So the honest number is closer to a modern work week than a permanent vacation. But that raw hour count still hides the most interesting part: what that work actually felt like day to day. And what people did with everything left over. Here's what a real day tended to look like. You wake up near dawn to a fire that's been kept smoldering since last night. Breakfast is whatever's left from yesterday, eaten while people talk and loosely figure out the day. And here's the part that breaks most people's assumptions. You don't necessarily go out to hunt or gather at all. If the last outing was successful and there's food in camp, plenty of days are spent right there, repairing a spear, softening a hide, weaving a basket, because a useful skill earned respect, not because a clock demanded it. When a hunt does happen, it's often not a sprint and chase. Human beings are unusually good persistence hunters, capable of tracking prey for hours in the heat until the animal simply overheats. It's something covered in more depth in another video on this channel, about why ancient humans were such frighteningly effective predators. That kind of hunt might eat up 3 to 6 hours, including travel, and then often by early afternoon, the day's productive work is essentially done. What happens next is the part modern life makes genuinely hard to picture. People rest, they sit in the shade, they groom each other, they mind children, they chip designs into bone or stone, or simply do nothing in particular. And crucially, this wasn't wasted time. In a world with no money, no police, and no written contracts, your survival depended almost entirely on your relationships. So investing hours in other people wasn't a luxury. It was infrastructure. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner spent years recording conversations among the Jew/Hwansi, and she found something fascinating. During the day, conversation was overwhelmingly practical: logistics, plants, who saw tracks where. But at night, around the fire, roughly 81% of conversation shifted to stories, myths, distant adventures, jokes that had the whole camp laughing. And that's very likely where a huge amount of human culture, shared myth, humor, and history actually got built. And there's evidence this wasn't just idle chatter. It shows up carved, drilled, and painted into the archaeological record. In Chauvet Cave in southern France, discovered in 1994, paintings dated to roughly 30,000 years ago show horses, lions, and rhinoceroses rendered with shading and a real sense of movement, not crude scratches. Genuine skill that took real time to develop and real time to execute deep inside a cave by firelight. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, roughly 75,000 to 100,000 years ago, people were engraving abstract cross-hatched patterns into pieces of ochre. They were also stringing shell beads together as jewelry. using a species of shell that doesn't even live near the cave itself. Someone had to travel to river mouths along the coast, gather those shells, carry them back, and then spend time turning them into something decorative, purely to look good. And in Germany, a flute carved from a vulture bone around 40,000 years ago, discovered in 2008 at Hohlefels, has 5 carefully spaced finger holes, meaning someone understood pitch well enough to plan them out. None of that buys food, none of it brings down an animal, none of it gathers water, and all of it takes hours nobody had to spend. There's also a quieter kind of evidence, written directly into bone. When bioarchaeologists compare the skeletons of hunter-gatherers to those of early farmers who came right after them, the farmers tend to come out shorter, with more dental cavities from grain-heavy diets, more joint damage from repetitive labor, and shorter lifespans on average. It's one of the more uncomfortable findings in the field because it runs directly against the assumption that agriculture was simply an upgrade, which brings us to the turn nobody saw coming. Around 10,000 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent, people began planting seeds and keeping herds on purpose. Some researchers, echoing an argument popularized by Jared Diamond, describe this as something close to a trap. Farming let populations grow, but a bigger population needed more farmed food to survive. More food required more farming, and once populations grew large enough, returning to the old way of life became increasingly difficult. Even though the bones suggest that in many places the transition made day-to-day life physically harder, not every archaeologist accepts that framing wholesale. Others point out that farming also brought very real advantages: food surpluses, permanent settlements, and eventually the population density that made cities, specialists, and written history possible at all. But the immediate transition came with significant costs: harder physical labor, worse average nutrition in many early farming populations, and over time, increasingly structured forms of work and obligation that looked very different from the flexible rhythms of mobile foraging. So no, ancient humans weren't living in some effortless paradise, waking up already at peace with nothing to prove. The bones and the time use studies both say the work was real, often close to what you'd log in a modern week. But the shape of that time looked almost nothing like ours, work that started and stopped with the animal in the season and the food already in camp, wrapped around long, unhurried stretches of rest, gossip, grooming, and apparently an awful lot of quietly excellent art. Go back to that fire at dawn one more time. Nobody's rushing out the door. Someone's tending the fire. Someone else is looking at a half-finished tool, and someone is deciding, genuinely deciding, that's whether today is a hunting day or a carving day. That choice, more than any exact hour count, it might be the real difference between their day and yours.